Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a historical disaster of just unimaginable proportions. It's this incredibly gripping story of wartime urgency, a tragic, almost unbelievable alignment of fatal errors, and a morning that began like literally any other, but ended with an entire city completely devastated. So get comfortable and prepare yourself, because today, we're looking at the day Halifax was destroyed in mere seconds.
I want you to pause and seriously consider that question for a moment. What if a single explosion could wipe a thriving, bustling city completely off the map in less than a minute? I mean, long before the atomic age, the very concept of a blast capable of leveling a city was completely unthinkable. No one could even fathom it. But in 1917, the fragile reality of human existence was absolutely shattered by a simple, terrifying mistake. A cascading series of miscalculations transformed a quiet harbor into ground zero for the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen up to that point.
Okay, let's dive right into this and set the scene. Let's wind the clock back to 1918. During World War I, Halifax, Nova Scotia wasn't just some sleepy, quiet coastal town. Not at all. It was Canada's primary military embarkation port. Because it was the closest large North American port to Europe, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and just massive mountains of supplies were constantly funneling through its deep-water terminals, all heading over to the battlefields. It was a thriving, highly cosmopolitan, and heavily militarized hub. The place was absolutely buzzing.
Now, bringing it into focus, right in the center of the harbor, there is this incredibly tight geographical choke point. It's known locally as the Narrows. It's essentially this constricted waterway connecting the outer Halifax harbor to a protected inner anchorage called the Bedford Basin. And on the morning of December 6, 1917, this narrow little corridor turned into an incredibly high-stakes crossroads, setting the stage for a deadly, slow-motion encounter between two massive vessels.
Enter the first of those vessels, a French cargo ship called the Mont-Blanc. Now, because of the extreme, very real risks posed by German U-boats prowling the Atlantic at the time, wartime regulations had been dangerously relaxed. Ordinarily, a ship carrying the kind of cargo the Mont-Blanc had would never, ever be allowed anywhere near a busy harbor. But on this specific morning, a pilot named Francis Mackey was tasked with guiding what was, quite literally, a floating bomb right through the Narrows to join up with a military convoy. And when I say a floating bomb, I am not exaggerating. Just wrap your head around this payload. Down in its hold, the Mont-Blanc was packed with 2,300 tons of picric acid, 500 tons of TNT, and 10 tons of gun cotton. It's an unbelievable, terrifying amount of explosives. But the most dangerous element, it actually wasn't down in the hold. Strapped all along the weather deck were rows of barrels filled with highly flammable, high-octane benzol. And as we're about to see, those deck barrels were the true catalyst for the absolute nightmare that was about to unfold.
Heading in the exact opposite direction through the Narrows was an empty Norwegian ship called the Emo. At 8:45 a.m., amidst a super confusing, chaotic exchange of whistle blasts and completely misread signals over who had the right of way, the two ships collided. Now, because the Emo is completely empty, it was riding really high up in the water, meaning its prow sliced straight into the Mont-Blanc's starboard side. The physical damage itself wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't a ship-sinking crash, but the impact toppled those barrels of benzol, spilling volatile, highly flammable fuel all over the deck and pouring down into the hold. When the Emo reversed its engines to pull away, the scraping metal created a single spark, and that was it. The benzol ignited instantly.
What followed was an agonizing 20-minute gap between the collision and the ultimate disaster. It's a real tick-tock countdown. As the fire grew completely out of control, the Mont-Blanc's captain ordered his crew to abandon ship. So now, you have this burning, pilotless vessel slowly drifting toward Pier 6 on the Halifax shore. And here is the truly tragic irony of it all. Everyday citizens, factory workers, kids walking to school, they all started gathering at the shorelines and crowding around their windows. They were entirely unaware of the massive chemical payload burning inside that ship. They just thought they were watching a really spectacular fire. But, not everyone just stood by and watched. The first responders sprang right into action. The crew of a nearby tugboat, the Stella Maris, led by Captain Horatio Brannan, heroically steered their tiny ship right toward the inferno, desperately trying to hook a line and pull the burning Mont-Blanc away from the city pier. Meanwhile, back on land, firefighter Billy Wells and the crew of the Patricia fire engine raced directly into the blistering heat. These guys were risking absolutely everything to stop a fire that, tragically, was already completely unstoppable.
Just yards away from all this, at the Richmond railway station, a 44-year-old train dispatcher named Vince Coleman suddenly learned exactly what was on that burning ship.
His first instinct was to run for his life. But then he remembered train number 10. This was an overnight passenger train with 300 people on board, and it was due to pass directly by the burning ship at literally any minute. Coleman stopped, turned back to his desk, and sent an urgent, incredibly desperate telegraph down the line. It read, "Munition ship on fire, making for Pier 6. Goodbye." His completely selfless sacrifice stopped the trains in their tracks and ended up saving hundreds of lives.
Moments after Vince Coleman tapped out that final message, at exactly 9:04 a.m., the Mont-Blanc's volatile cargo reached its critical limit. The resulting 3-kiloton explosion instantly, and I mean instantly, vaporized the entire Mont-Blanc. The blast was so incomprehensibly powerful that a piece of the ship's anchor weighing over 1,000 pounds was launched straight into the air and landed more than 2 miles away in a neighborhood called Armdale. Let that sink in. A half-ton piece of steel thrown 2 miles.
The physics of this blast are absolutely staggering. Right at the epicenter, temperatures spiked to 5,000 degrees Celsius in a fraction of a second. This instant massive release of heat completely vaporized the water surrounding the ship, briefly exposing the actual floor of the harbor. And when millions of gallons of water rushed back in to fill that massive void, it created a 60-foot-high tsunami that surged violently over the shoreline, sweeping away people, debris, and literally entire buildings.
The visual horror of that exact moment was permanently etched into the minds of everyone who survived. Judge Benjamin Russell, who witnessed it firsthand, described it like this: "A gently curving column of fire, of all the colors that fire can assume, ascending from the region of the dockyard. The explosion punched a massive, miles-high chimney of smoke into the sky. And soon after, the vaporized fuel, unburned explosives, and shattered pieces of steel began falling back to Earth in what survivors horrifyingly described as a heavy, greasy, dark rain."
The human and structural toll was frankly apocalyptic. The numbers are hard to even wrap your head around. Approximately 2,000 people were killed instantly or died shortly after. Another 9,000 were severely injured. In the Richmond district, which was nearest to the blast, 1,600 houses were completely obliterated, just flattened. The local rail yards were destroyed, with over 500 massive train cars blown entirely off their tracks. An entire section of a modern, bustling city was simply erased in a heartbeat. Yet right in the middle of this mechanical, widespread devastation, there were these tiny, impossible miracles. For instance, a 23-month-old baby named Annie Liggins somehow survived the utter destruction of her family's home. She was found 26 hours later, sheltered underneath a stove next to an ash can. That residual heat kept her from freezing to death in the winter storm that followed. The press called her Ashpan Annie, and incredibly, she lived to be 95 years old.
But we have to be clear, miracles like Annie's were incredibly rare. Directly across the Narrows on the Dartmouth shore sat Tufts Cove. This was a long-standing Mi'kmaq settlement where families lived in framed houses and traditional wigwams. The sheer force of the blast and that terrifying 60-foot tidal wave completely wiped the settlement off the map. Similarly, the predominantly black community of Africville, even though it was partially shielded by a bluff, suffered severe casualties and terrible destruction. The explosion brutally did not discriminate.
And as if things couldn't possibly get any worse, the very next day, a severe winter blizzard struck Halifax. It blanketed the ruins in freezing snow, plunging temperatures, and drastically complicating the frantic rescue efforts. Meanwhile, as the heavily damaged Norwegian ship Emo sat beached over on the Dartmouth shore, a chaotic legal blame game was already starting. The Mont-Blanc's pilot, Francis Mackey, and Captain Lemedic were heavily scapegoated in the press. They were initially charged with manslaughter, though a judge eventually dismissed the charges, finally recognizing it for what it was, a sheer, tragic compounding of human errors.
Now, one of the most unique and honestly harrowing legacies of the Halifax explosion was the medical aftermath. Because so many curious people were standing right at their windows watching the fire when the ship blew, the supersonic shockwave shattered glass across the entire city, blowing it directly into people's faces. Over 1,000 residents suffered severe eye injuries. Medical professionals, like a man named Dr. George Cox, worked tirelessly round the clock performing hundreds of emergency eye removals. This very specific, widespread tragedy directly catalyzed the formation of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind.
So how do you even begin to rebuild from the ashes of something like this? Well, Halifax did, and it changed the future of emergency planning forever. The city constructed the Hydrostone neighborhood, which was specifically designed from the ground up to be fireproof. Global maritime safety regulations were completely overhauled so this could never happen again. A massive $30 million relief fund was established. But perhaps most remarkably, the city of Boston immediately dispatched a rescue train fully loaded with medical personnel and supplies, pushing relentlessly through that brutal blizzard to provide life-saving aid to a completely overwhelmed city.
And that brings us to something really special. It brilliantly illustrates how enduring human solidarity can emerge from our absolute darkest times. In profound gratitude for Boston's immediate, life-saving response, the province of Nova Scotia established a beautiful tradition. Every single year since 1971, Nova Scotia selects a towering, magnificent Christmas tree and sends it down to Boston. It proudly stands in the Boston Common as their official tree, a permanent, living thank you for the compassion shown when Halifax needed it the most. Which leaves us with a final, thought-provoking reflection. The Halifax Explosion is a chilling, historical reminder of the raw, untamed power we wield as humans. It forces us to ask, how do we balance the incredible progress, the industrial might, and the speed of our modern world with the incredibly fragile reality that a single miscommunication, a single spark, can literally shatter it all? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into history leaves you informed and maybe looking at our modern world just a little bit differently.